Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Now, as Moya has said, yes, Egyptologists talking about Rome is a bit peculiar, but we are rather inundated by the Romans in our later years. Generally, of course, when you think of ancient Egypt, one thinks of the Nile Valley with all of these accoutrements that come with it, very definitely pharaonic. But it has not always been that, because, of course, as you know, after the unfortunate man choice of Cleopatra and 30 BC, she wound up relinquishing our country to the Romans, which was... Can you hear me? Okay, good. Which was rather a tragedy from certain perspectives, but of course I think Rome clearly benefited, as did the entire Western civilization. By the way, I'm not Egyptian, so no one can accuse me of nationalism. I'm really from Pakistan. Anyway, to, again, mise en scène, this is Kharga Oasis. Here you have Cairo, here you have Luxor, and this long thing is Kharga Oasis. It is the largest and most southern of Egypt's oases, and plays rather a key role in Egyptian history. This gives you a sense of what Kharga looks like. Here you have this depression, and here is the scarp all around it. Now, Kharga is very important for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, are the trade routes, and you can see here some of the routes that connect the Nile Valley into the Western Desert, and here you have this long route called the Darb al-Arba'in, the 40 days road, and this took people down into Sudan, sort of near Darfur area, and it was an alternate route to the south, to Africa, bypassing the Nile. And at critical moments in Egyptian history, when things were not always smooth in the Nile Valley, that provided people with an alternate route through Africa. Okay. Do I need this? Yes. Okay. Right. Now, this whole thing is Kharga Oasis over here, and the part outlined in yellow is our archaeological concession. This is where the North Kharga Oasis Survey, that I co-direct together with Corinna Rossi, this is where we work. And you can see that it is rather large. We got a bit more than we bargained for. Now, the most important thing, and in fact the thing that we noticed first, were the standing remains, which happened to be 90% Roman. So we have things dating from the 1st century AD until about the 6th century AD, which we're going to see. And most of these happen to be forts. And I'm sure you are all familiar to some degree with Roman fortification. But you will have never seen the like, as you will see from here, because although Corinna and I have been looking for parallels rather madly, we haven't found any yet. So it is quite an interesting kind of fortification system that I'm going to be showing you, inshallah. Now, as I said, very important for trade routes into Africa, into perhaps even far away Libya, but certainly into the Sudan. And on these trade routes, of course, we would send wheat, and we would get in return either gold, ebony, ivory, animals live or dead in the form of skins, and sometimes slaves, and also, you know, any other exotic items that one could get from Africa. And here is one of the cairns that marks one of these rather convoluted routes through the desert. Kharga was also very well known for its mineral wealth, and here we have Luxor Temple, where Ramses II, in fact, lists a whole series of materials that came from all parts of Egypt as tribute. And from Kharga, it is listed that there is one element called misfit that came to Egypt proper. Unfortunately, we don't really know what misfit is, but having gone through what Kharga produces, the chief thing in terms of mineral wealth is alum. Alum is very useful for when you have a cut or a nick. In fact, gentlemen used to use these for shaving. So if you had, you had a little nick while shaving, you'd take one of these alum sticks and stick them on, and it would disinfect, deodorize, and generally stop you from bleeding. Alum was also used, in addition to medical things, it was also used in mummification. So we have lists of alum being used, and having done some experimental work, I think probably once you had removed the internal organs, you would rub some alum all over the body to help stop the bleeding and again make sure that disinfection and deodorizing and so on was going on, and so that there would be less scope for bacteria to flourish. And of course alum is used in leather tanning and also in dyeing clothing. So that seems to be Kharga's main mineral wealth, as well as red and yellow ochre that was used for paints as well as for makeup. Naturally, of course, when we talk about an oasis, the most obvious thing would be agricultural wealth. And indeed, Kharga had that. Dates, even now there are 82 variety of dates that come from Kharga, and of course wheat. There was a reason that Egypt was the grain granary for the Roman Empire. And in fact, in the Roman times, a lot of the oases of Egypt were exploited because of their agricultural wealth, which was then shipped off out of Egypt and used by the rest of the empire. Kharga used to be incredibly famous for its wine, and from the 26th dynasty onwards, say about 700 BC onward, it was a major wine producer. By the time we come to the Romans, again, the wine was being exported not just through the Eastern Mediterranean, but throughout the rest of the Roman world. There is sadly no more wine in Kharga, something that makes all of the archaeologists severely depressed, so we have to bring it in from Cairo. So I have painted a lovely picture of this blissful Isle of the Blessed, as the Herodotus and others call these oases. But it wasn't always thus. Here before you, you see the banishment stele. And it basically relates how someone who had gone against the king was sent off in exile to Kharga, because of course it takes you about 6 days to get there. And then once you're there, unless you are part of the caravan, there is really little way out without water, and there is none en route. So various people have been banished to Kharga throughout Egyptian history from 2000 BC onward, and even in the Christian era you have Athanasius and Nestorius being exiled to Kharga, which is why in fact it was one of the sites where we have a lot of interesting varieties of Christianity being practiced right at that transitional period between paganism and Christianity. Even today, one of the largest prisons, high security prisons in Egypt, is located in Kharga Oasis, and of course it causes us a great deal of trouble trying to get permits to work here. So when other Egyptologists just need 2 or 3 pieces of paper to get going, we need about 7, sometimes 9. But there you go. The remains we have in Kharga range from the prehistoric period, this is for you, and go straight in through to the Roman and in fact Romano-Byzantine era. The ancient name for Kharga was Hebet, probably, and Hebus, and in the Greek and Roman times. And this, in fact, is Hebus Temple, and this is the site that really gave the oasis its name in antiquity. Now, the thing, of course, that captures one's attention are the Roman forts. And here you see one of the largest Roman forts we have in Kharga Oasis, with its battlements and its entire sort of beautiful setting in the desert. It connects to one of the trade routes that goes into the Nile Valley. But you will notice that it is made entirely of mud brick. And all the forts that I'm going to show you are mud brick forts. In the eastern desert in Egypt, we have stone forts. This is the only part of Egypt where we have mud brick. Bahariya Oasis, that you might have heard of, further to the north, also has a couple of mud brick forts, but they're not very well, they don't survive. They're about this high and grungy looking, and that's being nice. Now, here is our concession. This is where we work. How to basically address this 170 square kilometre plus area. Well, this is what it looks like now. Bits of it still look like that beautiful green oasis, but most of it has been overtaken by desert as the water levels have sunk and there is less and less water in terms of precipitation available here. You can see here we have some of these mud lions or yardangs, which are the remains of the lake, ancient lake, that was located over here, and then it's been weathered away. But all of this silt that was found at the bottom of the oasis is what made the soil quite so rich. Now, how do we go about this? Well, Corinna and I met in our office over our cup of tea to discuss how we're going to deal with this entirely large site. So basically what we sorted out is that you do a lot of driving, and we drive around, and then when we think some place looks like it might be hopeful, we get out and we do a lot of walking. Sometimes when we find rock art, we do some climbing. That very, very, distinguished image. When we find holes in the ground, we must investigate. Often they're tombs, sometimes they're other things, and sometimes they belong to an animal who is rather cross at having us invade. And although we are a survey and we're not supposed to dig, perforce we must excavate. We do try and get our car to be in a place where we really want to dig, but frequently it pays no attention whatsoever to us. Once we have located a site by any of these means, we set about drawing a sketch map and then doing a survey with a theodolite. And here are some of our surveyors, most of them are my students. We do archaeobotanical and archaeozoological recovery and surveys. Of course, we do collect the ceramics because these are what give us the best sort of understanding of what lies beneath the surface. We have a lot of site deflation, so sometimes you can get your whole Roman, your New Kingdom, and your prehistoric stuff all together in one convenient layer. But at least when we have our ceramic specialists, they can inform us of what we do have. And one thing, a tool that has proved invaluable is aerial photography. We use kite aerial photography because of the prison, the hot air balloon was nixed. We cannot use helicopters, we cannot use planes. But when we said, oh, would you mind if we flew a kite? They sort of looked at us as if we were crazy and said, yeah, fine. We didn't explain about this very nice camera here, which we fly up and it takes lots of pictures using remote control like you use for one of those cars. Of course, it is a very hit and miss kind of thing, and sometimes you take pictures of the sky and you take pictures of something else, but thank God digital photography has been invented because we can immediately pull it down, plug it in, download and see if we have any usable images. And this is what a lot of our landscape looks like. And about 12 o'clock, noon, when you're walking around, you can't see very much apart from there are a lot of potsherds here. However, aerially, suddenly it pops out and you can see the entire landscape laid out with some kinds of understanding of walls, field systems, water systems and so forth. So in fact the cap has been a very key feature of our work. Now I'm basically going to give you an introduction as to what kind of stuff we have at Kharga. The majority of our Roman remains seem to, at this point, remember we haven't excavated, but we have a tentative dates from the 2nd century AD up through the 5th century AD. And probably there are parts that are earlier. Some of the monuments that I will show you are, in fact, built onto more ancient Egyptian structures. Some are on Ptolemaic, i.e. Greek structures, some are more ancient Persian and still more Pharaonic. But most of what you will be seeing here is going to be Roman. And this is our first fort. When you descend into the Kharga Depression, the forts basically follow a line. And that line is the line of a caravan route. And then there's a sort of cross line, which is where another caravan route comes down and then takes a separate route across, breadthwise, into, in fact, Dakhla Oasis, which is located to the west, and in fact at Monash University, Colin Hope and his team worked there. So we meet halfway up the scarp with one another for our champagne and cocktails. And thence, in fact, the trade route seems to go, as far as we know from the work of our German colleagues, into Libya and perhaps into Chad. And this is something that we had not really realized before we had all started doing these explorations, because everyone kept saying, the Egyptians stuck to the Nile Valley, and if you go out of the Nile Valley, there'll be little pockets of civilization and forget the rest of it. Well, we seem to actually have been able to prove that we have connections that go all over Western Africa, or Eastern Africa going towards West, from 3000 BC on throughout the Roman era, up to at least 500-600 AD, and then I think it's just taken over by the next batch of invaders, which would be Islam. Anyway, here we have, this is Ain Jib, so I'm going to show you some of our forts north to south. This one is located on one of the only hills we have in Kharga, and it seems to have been made expressly for the purpose of supporting this fortlet, which you see over here. So 4 squared walls, a little bit of buttressing at the corners. This wall, poor thing, has completely collapsed and fallen up. Now, all of the doors tend to be, or the majority of doors tend to be on the south, because there's a horrific north wind that comes through. And so to be protected, you will see the same sort of module of building repeated. Right over here, you will have lots of water, and this is in fact the first water that you get after 4 days' march, if you are coming swiftly on your donkeys. We didn't have camels until about 500 BC, so when the Romans were here, we definitely had camels, but otherwise donkeys were the main mode of transportation. So one of the important things with these forts is the fact that they would protect the water and they would oversee who could have access to the water. Generally, when we think of forts, one tends to think of them as being defensive structure. That's not really the case in Kharga, as you will see as I show you the architecture. Not far from Jib is Sumaira. Jib is about back there. Here's Sumaira over here, which is much smaller. It's in a flatter area. And in fact, this is surrounded not just by water sources, but a whole settlement. The survival is very differential, and a lot of the stuff, in fact, here, this is sand covering entire houses. So you can't see them. For some reason, only the fort sticks out. It took us years to figure out where the settlements were, but that's where they are. Now, Sumaira also has a very similar thing, small square fort with these tiny little bit of buttressing. When you go further south and then start heading out towards Dakhla and the west is when you see one of our most beautiful places, Dabadib. And this is a rather large site. It's around a mini oasis. This is in the south, and up there in the north you have another section of this. But the south is where you have this fort, and it again punctuated a route. It marked the way the route went. And just before you met that would be Ain al-Labakha. Now these two you can see are much larger, and at the corner you can see the bastions and the towers. Now all of these are built around a central courtyard, which is very small, and then you have 3 to 4 levels of the building itself, made with barrel vaults and then floors put over them. Now, the fort at Dabadib is unique in that you can actually access the towers and go up them and down them and look out from them. This one, once you have sort of thrown a stone at the local snake to warn it of your coming, is a very nice stairway to go up and down. This one is less well preserved. But what is interesting is that is the only fort in all of Kharga where you can actually access the towers. The other ones are all just for show. They might give a little bit of ballast to the bolster up the corners, but they don't really do anything of any other use. And you will see that they are all built in a similar way, where you build up a section of wall, and you build up another section of wall, and they lean against one another in an optimistic way. There is no bonding between the sections. So if you were really going to use this as a defensive structure, it's not going to be very defensive, is it? Furthermore, okay, and here we have the inside, and that just gives you a sense of the mode of construction, where you have the barrel vaults, elliptical vaults, floor, another one, and then right on top you have a place where it's well protected, but you can walk around, and so you can control the perimeter and see from all four sides, as well as using your bow and arrow, kill people from all four sides, which is quite convenient in a fort. Now here we have Castle Jib, and there you can see the walkway up there. And again, this one is also made in these sections that lean against one another. But if you look here, you can see that's 1.5 brick thick. It's not really anything that would be defensible. If someone decided to go up there with even a mini battering ram or 4 people, even with just good kick, you can go through it. So really, these are more for show. It's a bit like a Potemkin village, where it looks very grand from a distance, but when you get up there, there really isn't anything to protect the people within. So it is a very unusual kind of fort, and probably not one that was meant to be provide defense, but more likely something that was going to show the might of the Roman Empire, to say, you will stop here because we are Romans here, and you will all stop. Because we're on a road, no doubt, toll. Let's collect some tax, check out the import or export of the kind of caravans that are going to and fro, make sure everyone's papers are right, and also control the water, no doubt for a small sum or a large sum. But really, in terms of defence, if there were any blemmies, who seem to be the local Bedouin types who would come and attack, it's not going to stop many blemmies if they are well organised. But if the blemmies don't know that the forts are really 1 brick thick, it might stop them in their tracks. The entryways to most of the forts are very similar. You have a stone lintel and sometimes stone door jambs, and then on top of that you have a little arch filled in with mud. And here you can see, again, absolutely fake tower. But it has a nice foundation. Now, at Al-Dabadib, what's quite interesting is that you also have an area around the fort that looks as if it's we used to call it the fortified settlement, but you notice it's in quotes. So here's the fort, and here we have these houses with later sections that have been sort of dropped in, and these are bastions here and buttresses. Now these buttresses are hollow again, so they are built in a triangle, and there's nothing, it's air inside. So again, it looks like a big solid buttress, and in fact the ancient Egyptian forts all had big solid buttresses. Nope. And we had one overexcited tourist come running through, went slamming into it and went through. So that was rather damage to archaeological site. But it gives you a sense. So that this wall again is 1 brick thick, and all of the houses that all look very similar because they're governmental standard bog issue, put one next to the other, are quite close together. Not necessarily because they're going to be defended against some kind of marauding hordes, but rather because they were against marauding weather. The sun, the wind, and the sand that was moved with the wind is so strong that you have all of these houses very close together, so that you have this almost labyrinthine street where you can go through. Now, obviously, one of the most important things for all of these fort locations would have been water. And again, at Jib, you have these wells, such as this one, lined up in front, and that's probably where the caravans got their first and last water. And we also found these curious things. Stone-lined shafts, some very nice, beautiful rectangles lined with sandstone, sometimes with sandstone covers, others that looked like a heap of rubbish, and we were never sure if they were a shaft or not until we poked and prodded a bit. Now the water was very important because you needed to cultivate the land. Now, all of this that looks like desert now, here's Sumaira, thanks to the aerial photography, you can see all of these are plots. These are Roman period plots of fields. And when you get things close together, that would be water courses organized. And I will be talking more about the water in a minute. But you can see that we have some quite large areas that were definitely cultivated, and our archaeobotanist has found 2 different kinds of wheat. We have some barley, we have olives, we even have the odd peach pit, herbs of different varieties and spices, and dates, of course, and apples, which is quite unusual. And in fact, Kharga is one of the first places in Egypt, together with Qasr Ibrim, where we have found the cultivation of cotton in the Roman period, 3rd century AD, plus cotton cloth to go with it. So there seems to have been a very early example of cotton, and we wonder if then the Romans had this and were exporting it out to other places. At the corners of our plots, we find these things. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to what that might be? Take a guess. Go ahead. Pillar? Nice try. Anyone else? Pardon? Plumbing? No. Good idea, though.
How big is it? Water-stored area?
That's what we first thought. It actually is a palm tree. But this is it's top down, it's all cut away, and that's what the palm trees look like when they've been dead for about 2,000 years. But what's interesting is because even now, at the corners of plots, to mark plot edges, they plant palm trees. And so we were standing there looking at this thinking, oh God, where's Alan, who's archaeobotanist? Well, we didn't even think we needed him at that point. We were poking and prodding, and suddenly it was a eureka moment, because you think these must have all, at the corners have been not just fields with green wheat, but they would have been punctuated with these palm trees, which anyone who's been to Egypt, you will see this again being repeated today. Now, the water in Egypt, in Kharga Oasis, is quite interesting because we have fossil water that's trapped between sandstone layers. And here we go. Here you have the different layers of stone, and then you have water going through. And basically, using gravity and a lot of helpful digging, you can get this water, this underground aqueduct, to come and finally spit forth onto above ground and then water your large complex of fields. And so what happens is that they dig a rather deep mother well, and then this actually should be a bit more slanted, going all the way to the surface channels. And you dig a little bit, and then sometimes from someone here who's measured up above, they're digging down, you're digging across, you hope not to kill each other, and you keep doing this. Each of the mouths of the shafts are marked by these spoil heaps here, which helps us to identify them. And then the water goes out into the fields, as you see here. Now, I'm going to show you one of the ones at Dabade. They run for 4, 5, 6 kilometers. So they are quite long things. It is possible that they started off on a small scale in the Pharaonic period. Certainly the Persians knew them, and many people think they invented them in Persia. The Persians exploited Kharga Oasis a great deal and started the agricultural exploitation of here in a serious way. The Romans took it to a completely new level, as they tended to do. And here you can see this hole, which is quite a large hole, and this is what the shaft looks like inside. And even today, the bottom's wet. Now see, up here, it looks like a keyhole, right? Over here, this was all filled with water at the best of times. Then the people who were maintaining the shaft would be bent over double, walking like this, trying to dredge things if there was a problem. And in fact, because no matter what you do to seal the top shafts, the sand keeps coming in and choking it, so you have to do this on a very regular basis. So this would have been the horrible, thankless task that people had to do, and then they would have to shimmy out from these things. which, is obviously very doable, but it requires upper body strength, which I don't have much of, so I got stuck. Anyway, this is one of the mother wells, and you can see how completely choked up it is now. Now, what's very nice is, at one of our sites, Ain Lebacha, there is a gentleman whose family has owned land here for maybe 1,000 years. And he, unlike all of his other family, really, the land went from being green and fertile to being desert. They all moved into town. Now, out of all of his family, he's a person who sort of really didn't like town life. And he liked to go out into the desert, which is quite unusual. And he also, though, wanted to have a little farmstead here. And he said, well, if it was good enough for the Romans, it's good enough for me. So what he has done is he has cleared about 1.5 kilometers of 2 of these underground aqueducts or canals and produced a pool of water, which in fact would have been originally higher up, and then using a pump, which is not quite Roman at this point because it's electric, has managed to cultivate. So he is in fact reusing this technology, and this whole area is green, and he's wanting to open up an eco-hotel, but that's completely another story. When you get the water out on top, in the best of, you have this sort of bank built up, and then these are these lovely terracotta canals that fit one into the other, and then they spill out into different places. And sometimes we have enough water pressure and things from the canals to even have mills. Not quite the same kind of mills. This mill, actually, this is an agricultural event. Here we have grinders. This is actually a mill that's powered by a donkey that goes round and round and grinds things up. Nothing to do with water, except for the fact that it's located near some fields. But obviously there was enough stuff being produced here. Now, that, just to remind you, north to south and then east to west. In addition to the fort, some of the sites that we have are more, they have habitations around them and have clearly secondary purposes or additional purposes. And you have other than the military living there. So here we have temples, and we have quite a few temples. Now, in the main body of Kharga, like I showed you at the beginning, you have Hebes temple, which is made of stone. And there are about 4 temples that are primarily stone. But there's a whole bunch of other more slightly vernacular architecture that is, again, relatively unknown in the Nile Valley, because most of the time it's been quarried and reused by later inhabitants, so it's been dug away. Whereas in Kharga, because most people there weren't as many people, it has survived. So we have a very rare set of mud brick temples as well. And this is one of these. The gentleman who is reusing the water is located about here, and this is the temple that goes with the site. There's a fort about here we are. But you can see it's mud brick. But you can also see up there, see the white? In antiquity, this would have been plastered and painted to give the appearance from afar of stone, of limestone. The Egyptians were very big, and clearly the Romans decided to follow suit, that if it looks the way it ought to look, then it is what it should be. And remember, the Romans were big on faux marble. They learnt it from the Egyptians. Everything was invented in ancient Egypt, except for the telephone. Okay, now all of these temples tend to have, their distinguishing features are the cavetto cornices and torus mouldings, and sometimes the remaining internal decoration where you have sand discs with wings and things like that. Now here at Ain al-Dabashiyya, this is another quite large temple, which you see. And it's about twice the length of this room. And they must have had various supports because, again, this was roofed in a straight way, not with barrel vaults. You have one pylon here, then you have the most holy of holies there, and then you had a colonnade in front of it made up of, again, mud brick, screen walls, with columns, so you had a nice processional route. The whole site this is it. The temple is the focal point here. All of this is cultivation. There's a large wellspring and a farmhouse here. There's probably some settlement over here, administrative building here, and all of that's a cemetery. This is another view of the temple that you see here, and the Cavetto cornice and Taurus moulding are very clearly visible. And what's nice is this. There's a little small Cavetto cornice Taurus moulding, and when you crawl in, there's space for a double flap door, and this was a place where a statue of the god would be. Now, generally for the ancient Egyptians, you people did not have easy access to the gods, to the temple. And even in the Roman period, this continued to be the case. There was the very much idea of, if you are not initiated, you can't go in. But by the Roman period, there was an increase of democratization of religion in a way, so people wanted to have access to their gods. So although you couldn't go inside the temple, a version of the god could be available on the outside. Generally, the doors were shut, but you knew the god was in there. So you would stand there and either, ding a bell or gong or clap and get the attention of the god, sort of burn some incense and then make your prayer. And on special days, they would open up these double flap doors and you could actually view the god in all of his glory and, in fact, have direct interaction with the divinity, which was quite nice. This is one of the sexiest buildings in the oasis. It looks bland from the back, but it is, in fact, a very complicated pigeon tower. It could hold about 150, 160 birds, and we have these pigeon towers punctuating the landscape every 2.5 to 3 kilometers. Now, of course, pigeons, even today, are eaten, and their guano is very useful as fertilizer. But what about pigeon post? In the Ottoman period, they used to rely on that, particularly away from the Nile Valley, because, of course, if you're in the Nile Valley, you can send boats down, people can walk down, you can, on the cliffs, and they indeed did in the Roman period, have little watchtowers where you could go and shine things and communicate, but not here. We have tried from our different forts standing there, waving things and trying to use mirrors to reflect, but we haven't been overly successful thus far. But we figured that pigeons would actually work as a mode of communication between spaces in the oasis. So it might be my rich fantasy life, but I'm sticking to it. Now, at Muhammad Tuleb, here, this looks like a massive mud brick, and when we first got to the site, it was almost completely engulfed by a sand dune. And the dunes move about 12 meters, or between 12 and 18 meters a year. So every year we go back and we think, oh shit, we missed that last time. But it's quite good because then we find things that we have missed. So the sand dune moved on, and we hadn't gone back to the site for 2 years, and we suddenly said, oh, look, we know what this is over here. It's not, because it was this big rectangular structure with some reinforcement, but it didn't have all the characteristics of a fort. But we found that certainly part of it was, and you can see here, there's a line, another line here, a bit of slumping going on. This is again Cavetto cornice, Taurus moulding, and this was a screen wall. So there was originally an Egyptian-style temple here, and then it was engulfed into a larger structure, and then still larger, and probably became like a caravanserai. And when we crawled into this hole, home of another, luckily non-poisonous snake, we found these very nice pieces of painted plaster that give us the name of Horus, son of Isis, and it's Horus of Uhu. Of course, there happen to be 4 different Uhus in Egypt, and you can differentiate them by the last sign in the name, which of course is missing. So, 7 hours later of sifting material and finding not very much what we wanted to, we gave up. But here we have Horus of Uhu, here we have his father Osiris in his traditional green, and then we have more text. So this is probably a Ptolemaic Roman temple. And later on, no doubt, the cult of the emperor was inserted in here, not too subtly. This is another one of our temples, and this was made of sandstone, which is again painted and plastered to look like limestone, which is higher quality. This is the temple here. It was a tripartite shrine. It was surrounded by an enclosure wall, of which for some reason only the stub remains. There's a great portal over here, which was also made of stone. Well here, and wells all around. And also housing. Here we go. That's the area I'm going to focus on. And here is the temple. Now what's interesting, this doorway, when we were crawling around inside, I found that it had been blocked off by mud brick, which means basically it had been killed. The temple was no longer active. And that's because Christianity happened, and they built a church right in front of it. So you have the transition between the two religions, and probably over here it was a little bit firmer than it was at other places, where they're like, okay, we won't stamp it out completely, but we'll put ourselves in front of it, at, of course, a different east-west angle. And so we have one of the earliest churches in Egypt here. It's probably 5th century AD, and you can see it here. This is in the apse, where we've got the 4 of these little niches. The plaster and paint has fallen off, and we're not going to excavate it until we have a lot of funding, because if we are getting painted walls, we really need to have a lot of conservators with us before we dare go any further down. But it is quite nice because you can see this transitional moment in the Roman Empire. Now we had all of these blocks, and we kept thinking, we turned every blessed block over thinking, we want to know how it was decorated, to whom was it dedicated. And on the last day, here we go, this big. But it proves that it was decorated, and this is in fact a plant that comes on the head of one of these fecundity figures that you see at the bottom register of temples. So maybe the rest of it happens to be in a private collection. We don't know, or maybe it's in some village house. We kept sort of visiting people in the hopes of examining things on the floor and kicking things slightly, saying, "Ooh, have we found a bit of our temple?" Not making us popular. Now, at Dabadib here you have the fortified settlement, which I have already shown you, with our very nice fake things. And up north, where the settlement first started, not within the area of the fort, right next to a spring, we have this. And here is our temple, which was first started here and then enlarged. And this is what that looks like here. You can see huge room. And all of these bits of plaster, which showed that it was decorated inside. And I've been, even with these little bits of plaster, to recreate the schema of decoration. Here we have a god holding an Ankh sign, walking, holding a staff in front. So you had lines of gods. The top was covered with painted vine leaves and grapes, which later on segue into the Christian tradition. And all of the gods, we'd have rows of gods and then separated with bands of text, hieroglyphs. Now this is what it looked like in 2003. This is what happened in a year's time. There are a lot of vandals who come out and rob sites, and they don't rob them for the antiquities. They think there's gold there. So a front loader went through and dug down to the foundations and basically pulverized the entire monument. They did that to 2 other places, one thing that we had not completely recorded, and they went and dug up tombs. And they didn't really care because they wanted gold. So lots of ceramics, bodies, bits of linen, coffins just thrown about, helter-skelter, which of course makes our work all the more urgent because we feel that we really need to go and document these things before people go marauding. Of course, there's always the fear that it's us being there that causes the marauding, but I don't think so because this site has been looted a couple of times before we ever got there. So I think it's just something people do, but it is rather tragic, and it is a great loss to our understanding of the history of Egypt, particularly the Roman history, because for years and years people would say, oh, Roman rubbish, and dig through. And now it is much more important for us to find out all the different layers and also increasingly document connections with sort of the centre of empire and so on. Now here we have the fort, and you can see that probably the original settlement was like that, with these expansions put in, and one of the expansions is the church, which you see here. This too has enjoyed bulldozer activity, but we have some inscriptions. We have obviously people hanging around in church, being preached to, getting a little bit bored, writing their name. Sometimes they just wrote Christ's name, which was obviously more appropriate in the setting. We have hermitages for Coptic monks, where they write little inscriptions on the walls, and they have holes where they would put pegs or gazelle horns in so they could hang their clothes. And at some point the fort decided, yes, Christianity is a good thing, and so they engraved a little cross on the entryway. Now, whether that later on this fort turned into a monastery or not, we don't know, but it's something to speculate about. Houses are, of course, found at all of these sites, some above ground and some completely choked by sand. Most of them are 2 stories. Again, you have the whole system of barrel vaulting, and about 4 to 5 rooms for most of them. Naturally, there are tombs all over the place, and here you can see we don't have that much good quality rock, so we have a few rock cut tombs, but most of them are different styles of tombs. But these ones have been very weathered, but it gives you a sense of what we have. The majority of things are people pressed into the ground in little shallow graves, such as you see here. Or the alternative is they dig into the desert tafla, line it with mud brick, and then barrel vault it. So it looks like rows of little houses all over, because of course for the Egyptians and then later the Romans adopted this too. These were sort of homes of the dead. We have mummification being practiced of various varieties with excerebration as well as evisceration, but not everyone was prepared thus. Sometimes you don't have very well mummified people, and you can tell because they smell bad. Bits and pieces of funerary objects to go with them. This is one of my favourites. It's a nose. It's in the Roman era. We have these masks made of plaster which are quite large, and they sort of sculpt features on, and then they gild them. And of course for the ancient Egyptians, when you die you are transformed into a god, and the hair of the gods is made of lapis lazuli, their bones are made of silver, and their flesh is made of gold. And so this shows you the transformed person, and so when you see either yellow or gold, it shows you the transformed individual. So this is very much from the Roman period, where you get these people with their happy smiles, and they get lots of wreaths and things sewn on their forehead, much like these ones. So these are Roman period mummies from Egypt. We also have a canid cemetery at one of our sites, which is quite nice, and it's unfortunately for some reason I haven't marked it on the map, but here we have El Deir. And directly over here is the Bashea, which has the canid cemetery, and this connects to the site of Abydos. And in fact, at this museum you have quite a few objects from the site of Abydos, but that is where the god Anubis and Wawet, which are both canid deities, exist. And these gods became incredibly popular in the Roman period with soldiers. And you have these lovely images of Anubis, as you see here, but he's in Roman dress and contraposta holding his spear. And of course the soldiers liked him because, of course, dogs would go with the soldiers, and also Wawet and Anubis were desert gods. They would open the ways. So if you were some poor sod who'd come from the Black Sea region and been plonked down with the army in this alien environment, not only would you have your own gods, but you knew that this place had special gods. And so the Roman soldiers would adopt these gods, and they would start making votive offerings and treating them in just the way the ancient Egyptians did. And so you have a lot of Romans paying homage to this particular god all throughout the Oasis and the Nile Valley. Now, we also have found some of our alum mines at the site of Qasr al-Labakha. There's an ancient path that goes up to the mines and sandstone quarries. These are the houses that the poor people had to live in when they were working, and you can just make out the little tick marks. The Egyptian week was 10 days, and in the Roman period it remained 10 days. So you were out there for 10 days before you had your weekend. And so you can see they were going, oh God, 2 more left. Now, I am going to very, very briefly take you through another part of our site which has a mishmash of things, Roman, Egyptian, and other. So we're going to take this route that connects towards Dakhla Oasis and on into Libya and Chad, and we're going to go from Qasr al-Labakha to al-Tabadib and the Darb Ain Amur to the Temple of the Moon, Ain Amur. The route is littered with dead donkeys and dead camels. Now, the majority of these are probably relatively recent. They're only about 700-800 years old, because once they've been exposed for longer than that, they tend to just turn into powder. We have travellers' accounts of people who were travelling here in the 1809 and even in the 1920s, and they said that there were many more at that time. So in ancient times, as in today, you're going around. Imagine you're going either by foot with your worldly possessions on a donkey or a camel, and you want to rest, and you are going to rest at any available rock you find, because that's the only way you're going to have shade in this wretched place. So we follow the same pattern, and we check every rock in the area to see if we have evidence in the form of ceramics or in the form of inscriptions of people being there. And indeed, we do find things ranging from Ottoman pipes all the way to pots that are made in 1400 BC to Roman pottery of 2nd to 4th century AD, Roman glass, and some faience as well. Sometimes we've come upon little houses, emplacements for the Roman amphorae, which were put there obviously by the Romans at set points along the route. So you had a water depot. So this would have been part of an official route where the water had been deposited for people who were going to either go alum mining or who were going to get ochre or who were going off into the desert for other reasons. Routes are all marked by these cairns, as you see here. We have inscriptions of all sorts. This is actually, now we don't get very much in the way of Latin in Egypt. So throughout the Roman era, Greek and then later on Coptic was being used. So we do have inscriptions, and so these are all probably 3rd, 4th century AD travellers' inscriptions. These are more recent, 1952. But you can see they're difficult to date on patina. Now, recording the material here is very important because we have vandalism, where people are trying to steal these pieces of rock art, and we also have natural forces where you have bits and pieces just falling apart. Within 2 years, the rock sheared off all by itself and collapsed, and this rather excitable gentleman donkey fell into 2 pieces. So it is of crucial importance for us to do this recording before it's too late. We've already lost a great deal. Okay, here we go. This is one of our rocks, Ars Rock, and this was quite interesting because we found a new king, hitherto unknown in the Egyptian king list, and this is King R. It can be interpreted as the Great One, and here he is, meaning that perhaps in 3000 BC, this was a bit more of a belt at the time, but people were going off exploring the deserts and trying to see where they could go. In this panel, you can see the juxtaposition of something that was probably made in 4000 BC, together with something that was made in 1200 BC. So this site obviously was a good stopping point in antiquity for many, many years. We even have inscriptions here. Most of these 2 are pharaonic, where they talk about, this one talks about this man called Intef, who was the son of Intef, whose mother was the child of another Intef, and he came here with many donkeys. So that's quite nice. We have all kinds of people who come and do different drawings. Many of these seem to be of the Roman period. We have a sense of lots of men out in the desert being frustrated. Here we have other inscriptions, all pharaonic. Most of them are just little sketched into the rock, but some of them are very formally, nicely carved, which suggests that they are there for a larger kind of official expedition. We have this genre of individual. We call them affectionately the fat ladies, but they can be called a great number of things. Up till our discoveries, the Monash University people thought that they had the only ones in Dakhla, and that it was a single culture that only had a certain type of pottery and this kind of rock art located in a tiny part of Dakhla Oasis. Well, they decided that Dakhla wasn't good enough, and they moved east to Kharga, and we have in fact found some that are about 250 kilometers away from their original site, so it's quite an interesting thing. We still don't know much about them, but we can score points this way at least. This is one of my favorites. This might have been carved in the Pharaonic era or in the early Roman era, because one can debate whether this is a cross or whether this is an Ankh sign, or is it that transitional moment between the two. Because over here you have these three travelers sort of praying for life, and they hope that they will get to the other side of their journey safely. Of course, we have a lot of animals, and here you have these different kind of gazelles and oryxes actually, and a very cute little hippopotamus. Probably something they had seen in the Nile Valley and decided to document here. This is quite unusual because we have an example of spiders, the only old world spiders that have been recorded in rock art. So we're very proud of them, and please don't tell me they're not spiders. Here, in this overhang rock cave, you will see that we have quite a large panel, and I want to point out that we did not chalk these. Unfortunately, some tour group came along and we hadn't completed documentation. We were trying to check our drawings, in fact, from the previous year, when we came back and found that these had all been chalked, and so we couldn't really check properly. And plus the chalk winds up destroying this, but you can see that there's some sort of house enclosure, there are lots of people, and this site had been used and reused over the years, and the images added to. We also have images of snakes, something that looks alarmingly like a peacock. I'm holding off on its identification for the time being. And again, these pairs of individuals that had hitherto been seen only in Dakhla Oasis. What's nice is we find grinding stones, and our geologist pair here has in fact located a grinding stone quarry where he found a lot of the banks and some of the tools that were used to make these rough cuts, and he thinks he might even have found a little place where they were trying to sell them off to passer-bys. We have a lot of giraffes and oryxes, which are very common here, and we have even little cult places to the ancient Egyptian god Seth, god of the desert. So if you are traveling in the desert, you want to appease him, and here you have, it's a little vernacular shrine. There are very crude steps that go up, and the whole place is covered by carvings of this Seth animal. And the identity of the Seth animal is a separate lecture, or you can ask me a question. Anyway, we also have inscriptions dedicating the site to the god Amun as well as to Seth, and again, we have a Coptic inscription of Appa Silas, who is probably 5th century, who was wandering around and writing his name in the desert. We have boats of different periods, and there's some boats that seem to be, again, of the Roman era. So we have a sense of large-scale and long-term usage of these sites. This site is Fish Rock, because this rock has these images, and it has a lot of prehistoric material around the sides. And someone didn't like that fish. More of Our Lady. And I like this because this panel was carved at a variety of times. You had this person probably smiting an enemy or just standing there having a temper tantrum. These two people who are much later. And then this is a very nice vignette because you've got this dog barking vociferously at this oryx, and the oryx tail goes up and then it poos, because that's what they do when they're scared. And it's very nice because we have this kind of scene from later on in Egyptian art, in formal Egyptian tomb art, but it's nice to see its sort of origins lying here in the desert. Other different kinds of animals, again, and we have a very unusual painted panel. Half of the painted material has faded. You can just see little vestiges of bulls in the form of their legs over here, and then this peculiar set man with a bowler hat, don't know where he comes from, and this other gentleman. But they're quite nice, and you can sort of get a sense of what was made when by the colour and the style. We found a place which we call the skirt site with these little men in kilts, but most interestingly they show a gazelle, and this site is quite nice because we have a lot of gazelle, and even now people come from the oasis to try and hunt gazelle here. So it seems to have been a gazelle hunting site for a good 4,000 years. Oh well, sorry, actually no, 6,000 years. These are other people at the site. Recently we worked over here where we found, just in the middle of the desert, a tomb, which is quite unusual because there is nothing else there, and it's a single tomb, with inscriptions to the god Amun and the god Seth. And a lot of these footprints, the footprints are, you have them from Pharaonic through the Roman to, in fact, the Islamic period. Sometimes by looking at the sandals you can date them. So my friend, whom I call fondly Imelda, is going to look at some of the sandal pictures to see how many Roman ones we have, how many Egyptian ones we have, and how many Coptic we have. This was the person who was buried there. He was probably a young man. And you can see that he was mummified, but in a crude way. But it's a very peculiar thing to find something like this in the middle of the desert, and it's almost as if he died very dramatically there and became a local saint for people to give offerings to. Here we have another boat that seems to be slightly later in date. And then this is one of my favourite things. If you look at that, it looks rather like a seated bird. And it has a Horus falcon engraved on it. Just this past season we found a new site on the last 2 days, which we are hoping to go back and look at. It's probably a Roman farmstead with houses and a large-scale water supply, and you can see some of the pottery that marks the area. And we started to follow the water, and there we go. You can see this is part of a water supply system. And then it wound up here, and we thought, oh, there are a lot of large rocks here. Sandstone. Oh, we have, if there are any podiatrists who would like to donate to the North Kharga Oasis Survey, we would be happy to take donations, because we have to go and document over 250 feet in this area, dating from the good old Pharaonic period all the way into, I think, up to 1400 AD. Here you can see different styles. Hands, some animals, including the camel. And here we have this very nice winged Seth animal. Some stone basins to hold water, so we have cisterns. And so every season we think, oh, this will be the last year, but the sands of Kharga continue to surprise us, and we are hoping to go out in December together with my intrepid and well-dressed team to go and find new sites. And if you wish to learn any more about our oasis, please consult our website. Thank you very much.